Good morning. I hope you've all had a good night's sleep, ready for a lot of great information this morning, things to speak both to your mind and to your heart, because Amy and I are so blessed, again, just blessed to be with you and excited to see so many women here. I've been touched by many of the questions that come in and really moved by not only your love for God, but your love for others and the way that you are seeking to reach out to others and to be equipped for that. I'm also touched by those of you who are questioning. And it's as a Christian, and those of us who are believers in God, we have a personal, not only knowledge, but experiential knowledge and understanding of the goodness of God. We know God is good and we belong, and we feel accepted, and we feel fully loved and fully satisfied in Him. And we have this understanding that belief in God is true and it's well grounded. We have good reason and evidence and logic to back that up, that the Christian worldview makes sense of what we know and what we experience about reality. And sometimes, and oftentimes, I wonder, and I have wondered, when someone seems to be rejecting or pushing back against God, this wonderful, true God that I know and that we all know, what is behind that? What is causing that rejection if our deepest longing is to be loved and to be accepted? Why in the world would someone push back against the one who gives us the life that's truly life, the love that's deeply satisfying? And having come through studying apologetics and having a good confidence that our belief is true and that it is good, I was curious to investigate atheists who had become Christians. I wanted to know basically three things. I wanted to know what informed their atheism, that is, why did they believe that in atheism? Why were they atheists? I also wanted to know what allowed them to become open and to turn towards consideration of something different, something other than atheism. And then I wanted to know the ways and means in which God brings them on into faith to conversion, because just because you believe that something's true doesn't mean necessarily that you embrace it, right? So I wanted to see the full picture. I wanted to hear these God stories. And I can tell you that they were extraordinary. I was incredibly inspired by the way that God showed up in amazing ways and transformed these highly resistant lives to Himself, that they turned and became completely on fire for Christ. And I wanted to know how that happened. So I sat down with each of them, of 51 atheists, and heard their stories, and I'd like to share a little bit of that with you today. Hopefully it will give us some insight not only to the way in which atheists think or feel, but perhaps better ways to connect with atheists and help them to see the goodness and the truth of Jesus Christ. Now I'm going to be doing this through telling you the story of one of the women in my study. She's an extraordinary, grace-filled, highly intelligent woman. And I think you'll be inspired by her story, and hopefully we'll just weave it in and learn more about atheists altogether. Let me go back. The one thing that inspired me through her story is she said, Jana, we need to live an available life, because that's how she was touched. By those who made themselves available to her, she was able to see and know reality and truth and love and life in a whole new way. And the atheists that I spoke with, they were all over the board in terms of their strength of disbelief. Anything from I really didn't believe in God and I don't really care, an apathetic atheist or an apatheist, all the way to an anti-theist. That is, I know God doesn't exist and I don't want you to know him either. The woman I'll speak of, I'll call her Sarah. She had what you would call a lack of belief. That is, that she didn't believe in God, just like you wouldn't believe that fairy tales are true or Santa is real. It's not something she aggressively pursued or talked about. It was just part of her world. Oftentimes when you hear atheists and you say, why don't you believe in God? They'll give all kinds of rational, intellectual answers. And because they see themselves as very sober-minded, highly educated, highly intellectual people. They're the smart ones. They're the brights in society. And so they'll give you those kinds of reasons for why they push back. For Sarah, God was nothing more than an irrational projection of psychological need. That is, it's just a psychological crutch. You're a needy person and you need a sky daddy to take care of you. That belief in God was embarrassing. And that if God did exist in the minds of some Christians, he sure wasn't there. He was uncaring and seemingly absent. She thought Christians or Christianity was dangerous. It was man-made, judgmental, intolerant, certainly not relevant. It's a false, superstitious ideology. Basically, she said it was stereotypically ridiculous. And that's not uncommon to hear in the atheist world, in the atheistic rhetoric. In fact, nearly 2/3 said, I don't care what evidence you have. There's nothing going to convince me that God exists. Nearly 2/3. But for me, that begs the question, if there is evidence, is there a lack of intellectual honesty here that you would even hear it, to consider it? But it also demonstrates perhaps why, if we do have evidence that we do think is good and real and true, why they aren't open to listening. Because they have a predisposition, a willful volition not to hear. They don't want to hear, maybe. They just don't think there's evidence and they don't want to hear it. So this was a highly resistant crowd of atheists. They were also highly intelligent, very intelligent. They weren't the type to be duped by religious superstition. One of the first lessons that I learned is that we need to be an available listener, that we need not to judge an atheist by his persona sometimes, that we don't need to judge a book by its cover only. We need to open the book. We need to look beyond the cover and see what's inside. Because sometimes I think we know who the atheist is. We've heard stories, perhaps we've heard a lot of ridicule, a lot of criticism from voices of atheists like Richard Dawkins. But just as we are not all Westboro Baptists, all atheists are not the same. They're quite different. They present very differently, and you know what it's like to be ridiculed just because you wear the label Christian and haven't been given a chance to get to know someone or them to know you, for them to see that you're not who they project you to be. We need to grant the favor and really not just stereotype atheists as the other, as them, as that one. We need to look behind the cover. One atheist said to me, it's too easy to view people as nothing more than a collective set of arguments that must be defeated, instead of another human being who is deeply longing to understand their worldview just like we are. They are a person, not a problem. And that goes with all of our apologetics, right? We're certainly there are issues to be addressed, but they're people to know and to reach. So again, this intellectual persona is oftentimes put front and center, but we need to look behind the curtain and see what's informing perhaps those beliefs. In fact, all of us have a lot of things that inform how and why we hold beliefs. One of the things is certainly our people, our social group, our family, our friends. For Sarah, she was raised in a loosely Catholic family. She had no sense of personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Jesus was merely a cultural cliche. Her parents had a rocky marriage, and her mom was quite bitter about God. Her father was an alcoholic. Her brother saw Christians as nothing more than like a TV evangelist who just wanted your money. And she said, and that's the way I felt about him too. In terms of the larger culture, we're all influenced by where we live, our community, our larger world, the media, all the messages that come in our way. For her, she lived in a community, she went to a public school. It was a very affluent but small rural community because there were teaching hospitals, very prestigious doctors and hospitals, facilities, professors, academics, those kinds of things. She said it was a very comfortable community in which people didn't feel the need for God. So when you think about the messaging that's coming in to her life, she had negative messaging about God, experiential, and in her community there was just a lack of information or reference about God. So she really didn't have real exposure to who Christians were. We're also exposed to different experiences in our life that form our beliefs about everything, including who God is, positive, negative. For Sarah, she said, I felt very loved by my mom, somewhat by my dad, although he was very troubled. My father, he was in and out of our lives. He was gone quite a bit. And when he did show up, he was very difficult or violent or despondent. So by extension, I wasn't going to trust a father figure, and certainly not an eternal father. And you can see how someone might have that kind of point of reference. We're also informed by who we see ourselves to be, our identity, who we want to be, who we see ourselves to be. She saw herself as someone who was highly intelligent. She was an avid reader, a writer. She also saw herself as a very autonomous survivor. Listen to her here. She says, I was basically surviving. I was working several jobs and supporting my family. My dad was in and out of my life. My mom was a single mom raising us, and she was drinking at night. I was putting her to bed, and after she was drinking, I was working through school. I was so busy surviving. I knew I really had to survive on my own. My doctrine would have been self-sufficiency. I would have defined myself as an agnostic, someone who doesn't know whether or not God exists. By the time I was in my teens, she declared herself an atheist by the time she was 14. And that's not unusual. The average age of declared atheism among those that I talked to was 15. And you can imagine, I mean, that's a time where you're really starting to think more about the big issues in the world, and you're also being highly influenced by your peers, and you want a little bit of autonomy. And so it's not surprising to me that embracing of atheism is happening earlier perhaps than we think. There are a lot of, anyway, going to college, but that people lose their faith, but oftentimes it happens prior to. And we need to be aware of that. And we also our beliefs are formed by our passions, our desires, our choices for life and living, and the things that we want to do. We don't want to be told what not to do. Again, that really goes with the teenage mind especially. But even all of us, no one likes to be told what to do. This wasn't seemingly a real strong part of her story, but it's a strong part of many. So there are a lot of reasons for atheism. The reasons that she gave as an atheist is that there would have been negative social consequences of belief. It would have alienated her from her friends and family. She saw, experientially, she saw suffering. She heard of or referenced hypocrisy from Christians, intolerance of Christians, and we get a lot of negative messaging again in the culture against us. So, and I also asked her, once you became a Christian and you're looking back, what was the real reason for your atheism? And she said, personal pain. It fostered doubt and disappointment with God. I didn't have a perceived need of God, and I really didn't want God to be true. Notice what's missing here. Her reasons for atheism were not particularly intellectual, even though she was very intellectually minded. So I think it's a good case in point to say the real reasons, even behind the intellectual facade, are perhaps some real intellectual doubts. There are things going on underneath the surface that we need to pay attention to. Sometimes, I know when I graduated with a degree in apologetics, I thought, well, the evidence is so compelling, everybody should believe, but it's just not that easy, right? Because we're not just minds. We're human beings with minds, emotions, and wills, and a lot of experiences and things that shape, again, what we want or want not to believe. For the majority of those in my study, it seems that their pushback against Christianity and God were for many similar reasons. They didn't think that Christianity was true. Interestingly enough, the top answer was that they didn't have personal evidence of God. That is, that they didn't see or feel or know God in their world. It just didn't show up on their radar. Or perhaps I heard stories of unanswered prayer. Where were you, God? Why did you, God? Why didn't you, God? Those kinds of stories, or tragedies or accidents or things like that caused a lot of doubt and disappointment, as well as prolonged experiences like hers. Of course, there were intellectual pushback. There doesn't seem to be evidence. It's not rational. Certainly Christianity is not scientific. Those kinds of claims and reasons for non-existence. Also, they pushed back against the goodness of Christianity, or the lack thereof, with religious hypocrisy, and some just, again, had a lack of exposure to Christianity. So, as J. John would say, either I've met a Christian or I haven't met a Christian. That's why I'm not a Christian. Some just, again, admitted they just didn't want it. They didn't like the moral constraints of, again, a transcendent interferer. A few wanted to believe, but they just couldn't for various different reasons. But that was the very, very small minority. Or they just didn't feel a need for it. So again, all kinds of reasons why someone might reject God. And you have to think about it when you're forming your beliefs, and you are really comfortable or want your beliefs to be true, or they are true. You're always looking and open for things that confirm your beliefs. I mean, you're here. A lot of you are here to confirm the beliefs that you have. And we look for those things that already confirm what we want to be true, and sometimes we're closed off to things we don't want to be true. That's called a confirmation bias. We see what we seek. We find what we're looking for. Those atheists who were open to anything other than their own worldview were, again, in the minority, intellectually, emotionally, socially, and morally. So there are a lot of reasons, again, why someone might be resistant. Of course, there are genuine intellectual questions, and we do need to be responsible for addressing those, because they become incredibly important through the journey, because we don't want to embrace beliefs that we don't think are true. So that's incredibly important. But we also need to, again, pay attention to all of the other things that might be compelling a belief. Nobody holds beliefs or convictions in a vacuum. Their convictions are wrapped in a story. a story of how they got there and why they believe what they believe. Okay? So one of the first ways to engage with someone with any other kind of belief is tell me your story. Tell me your story. That's not an intimidating thing to do. You're not you're not trying to prove anything or present a fabulous, sophisticated argument or anything. All you're asking to do is, can I get to know you? And that's incredibly important. They want to feel valued and they want to feel listened, and that's how they feel loved. But also, it also allows us to understand who they are. We don't want to be giving answers to questions they're not asking. We don't want to be talking about things that when an objection is over here emotionally, they're hurting emotionally and we're giving an intellectual response. We need to really tap into what it is and why it is they have barriers. And we have to be good listeners. So be an available listener. Ask yourself, am I judging from a distance, or am I available to listen towards understanding? That's the first thing, and that's the easiest thing to do. People love to talk about themselves. Engage them. The next lesson that I learned is to be an available learner. That is, we need to step back, sit down, and take time. And that's why I'm so encouraged that you're here, because you are being an available learner. So I want to commend you for that. For Sarah, it was interesting. She reached a point in her life where she left and went to graduate school. She said it was one of the first things that cracked her open. She said, I finally got to university and I had the time to read, because I was not allowed to hold a job because of my scholarship. And I had this culture of contemplation. I actually read the Bible for myself and began talking to other Christians. I was researching world religions for my thesis. There had always been a longing in me I knew was there, but now I was able to sit with it. It's good to sit with it. In this busy, busy culture, to take time out, because that's where the Lord can speak, not only to you, teaching you, guiding you, but can also guide those who are actually looking, seeking to see. So she came to a place where she could sit back and understand big questions, and that's important. In my study, those who began seeking started asking questions of Christians. 57% said that Christians were not able to answer their questions. And that hurts. That is an indictment on us, but you're here doing something about it. So again, kudos to you, because you're looking to seek, to learn. And I applaud you for that, and I hope that this is a launching pad to do more. But we need to understand, and that all truth is God's truth. I remember one of the first lectures I had in apologetics at graduate school, and he talked about the cumulative case for God, and I was going, what is that? What is that? I have no idea what that is. I mean, I knew, I believed in God and the Bible and Jesus, and I didn't understand the reality of God, how God reveals himself everywhere in the universe. You cannot turn without experiencing the reality of God revealing himself to you. It's just a matter of whether we understand or have eyes to see. The book of nature and the book of Scripture go together. If all truth is God's truth, everything we see in creation, from the heavens down to the cells in our body, declare the glory of God. And if we know that, and we see and know the evidences for that, and Amy's going to talk about the evidences for God, we'll gain such confidence that we will lose whatever fear we might have, and understand that science is actually not something that points away from God, but believe it or not, the more we know about science, is proving more of the reality of God. The scientists are one who have the challenge. The Christians are ones who say, yes, see? It goes with our story. We have nothing to fear. Nothing to fear from science, nothing to fear from the world, no question too big. That's why I also love when Amy says, I love to talk to skeptics. Because she has such a solid knowledge that everywhere we go in the universe, from, again, the heavens to our sense of consciousness to who we are in our humanity, it all points to the fact that we have a creator who loves us. So we, again, have physical nature on our side, who we are in our humanity. These are things that also point to the reality of God. I love this quote. It says, the Christian worldview is the best explanation for reality. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. There's something very powerful about that, and when you wrap your mind around that, it's extremely powerful. The atheistic worldview, by contrast, is what they call a more reductionistic view. That is, its view of reality is much reduced, whereas the Christian worldview can look at the physical world and say, yes, God created it, it's good, and here's why. The atheistic worldview believes that the matter and the universe is all there is. There's nothing outside of matter. There's nothing outside of nature. There is nothing supernatural, no gods, at least a naturalistic form of atheism. And so, but there are many things that are outside this closed box of the universe that are hard to explain from the atheistic perspective. Things like, from a universe point of view, how did the universe begin? How did something come from no thing, from nothing? There's still no answer in the scientific world for how and why that happened. It's hard to explain from an atheistic perspective how life came from non-life. Even the most sophisticated chemists and biologists have a really hard time explaining the amazing complexity of the cell and the information in the cell. Where does that come from? It comes from nothing? They're having a hard time explaining it. What about who we are in our humanity? Who are we as humans? Are we nothing more than physical beings with no meaning, no purpose, because we're born from a blind, purposeless process? You are not special as a human. You are no different than any other thing in the physical universe. You have no sense of, I will say, atheists can be good without God. There is a sense of morality, but they cannot ground it. They have a felt sense and they have a mind that believes certain things, but they have no even ground for believing the truth of their own rationality. And those are things that you can understand when you delve into apologetics literature a little bit more, but just kind of take it for granted for me that within the atheistic worldview, you are nothing but physical matter in motion. As Richard Dawkins would say, you are an animated, complex piece of matter. There's nothing more. But we as humans can't live like that. There's a tension. We can't live as if we are nothing. We can't live as if we really don't exist beyond our physical body, as if we're not special or important, that we have no purpose, that we have no meaning. It's interesting to me that the atheist will say, well, I just create my own meaning. I don't need a meaning or purpose from God. But it begs the question for me, why do you even have to create meaning for yourself? That decries the fact that we have a felt need, that we're made for something more. right? That we want to exist as if we have purpose and that we're loved and that we have value and dignity. That can't be grounded in a naturalistic worldview. So, as Albert Camus says, you must spend your life acting as if life is not absurd. They call these things, they actually recognize these things as not being grounded in their own worldview, but they will say they are useful fictions to help them get through life. So they're willing to acknowledge it on an intellectual level, but it begs the question again, why does it not match up with your worldview? The reasons why Sarah and many began asking questions about Christianity and something other than atheism was, first of all, to disprove it. Because if they're going to look for something other than atheism, they want to make sure it's true before they believe it. But sometimes they were just contemptuous, and they just really wanted to dismiss it. But were amazed at what they found when they started investigating. But some actually wanted to move from atheism because they actually reached a place in their life where it just didn't make sense to them, cognitively, intellectually, or emotionally in their life. They really felt that life was empty, that it was meaningless. They wanted more, or it just didn't make sense. And some just wanted more in their life. They were seeking greater meaning and purpose, or to satisfy someone that they loved. We have more in common with those who have an atheistic worldview than we think. They have more in common with us. Sarah said, I began to realize that the option of atheism held nothing. It was meaningless, really. What is your answer to me, atheism? That there's no meaning and everything is meaningless and there's absolutely no truth and that itself is an absolute truth that you're trying to put forward? I began to realize that all of this began to disintegrate. It just didn't hold any water. And I was more suspicious by nature. I hadn't thought through the implications of being an atheist, but I did so more as I was beginning to realize that Christianity had something to it. And I found that to be both intriguing and really threatening, because the line is drawn in the sand. It is a little bit threatening to have some kind of a worldview that you despised, you had some disdain or contempt for, and then you find yourself drawn towards it. That is a place of tension and discomfort. It's some place you can imagine. Think about yourself. If someone asked you to completely flip-flop your worldview, say if you're a Christian to become an atheist, or an atheist to become a Christian, that's a very different way of looking at reality. Not only, it's more than just checking a God box or not. It affects the entirety of your life. It turns your worldview upside down, and it turns your world upside down. Where you belong, how your experiences are experienced, how you see yourself, how you see others, your moral values. There are a lot of things that flow from that, so that can be very disconcerting. So be mindful of that when we ask somebody, when we're asking or enticing someone towards Christ, that it is a whole life transformation. What is interesting about that, though, is that there were a couple in my study who said, when I realized how grand God's story is, how big it is, that it's more than just my personal salvation, they said then I realized it was something worth believing in. When you see that it's all of reality, and it requires everything. So I just want to put this in here for a moment, because sometimes on both sides, this cuts both ways. One perspective says, I'm smart and you're not, and sometimes we know with good reason and confidence that we have the right answers too, but we need to be very mindful of not coming across in any kind of arrogant way at all. One of the women in my study, she was a PhD, biologist, brilliant. And she came across a very intelligent Christian. She saw him writing in the paper and approached him actually to start engaging in dialogue. She said, I would not have continued forward in dialogue had I not seen that he was very kind. He was very open towards learning from me, as well as I was learning from him. We're asking them to be available learners towards our worldview. We need to be available not only to learn who they are as people, we need to learn their beliefs and understand what they're wrestling with and be able to answer those questions. So we believe that the Christian worldview is the best explanation for the way things are in reality. And so we need to be an available learner to take advantage of all of those things in which we can use in not only to build confidence in our own faith, but in order to engage with others. So ask yourself, in what ways am I growing in a worldview understanding of God? Well, you're here today, so I commend you for that. One other thing is that a lesson that I learned is to be available to live in and with those who oppose or are different worldviews. You see, we have a problem as Christians sometimes, and that we're perceived negatively because we don't engage. There's an us-them kind of mentality, just like we might kind of stereotype the atheist, they definitely stereotype us. One of the people that I spoke with, he said, I had no reference for Christianity in my world except for The Simpsons. Yeah. He said, that was the only reference I had for the goody-goody two-shoes that everyone loves to hate, this character on The Simpsons. I can't even think of his name. Ned Flanders, that's it. It was Ned. All Christians were Ned Flanders. They were not smart, they were intolerant, and sometimes Christians are perceived as dangerous, particularly in this world. In this culture at this time, even normative views within Christianity are judged to be dangerous and extreme. Sarah's view of Christians were that they were hypercritical, irrational, deluded. 72% thought Christians were irrational and deluded, by the way. Intolerant, have a negative view on life, not educated. One more sobering statistic. Not one person in my study thought Christians were educated people. That's an indictment, for sure. There's this sensibility that there's a dichotomy that's established within atheism that we believe in science, you believe in fantasy. We believe in fact, you believe in fiction. We're rational, you're irrational. We're strong, you're weak and needy. There's a sense that they are the adults in the room and that Christians are children or childlike who need to grow up. And that's a hard reality. So we need to break these stereotypes. We need to destroy speculations and every lofty thing lifted up against the knowledge of God. How do we do that? Sarah said that I met many Christians who challenged my stereotypes, who walked their talk, who lived the gospel. You see, I think that was true for many in my study. One said the key thing was having interactions with all of the Christians, even if I didn't necessarily respect them. Interesting, huh? Because it starts to break down the walls, the barriers, and things that they have built up in their own mind, their stereotypes. They start being peeled away like an onion when they start experiencing someone who is real, who is different, that's surprising. Oh, I didn't realize you as Christians could actually think. Oh, I didn't realize you weren't like Ned Flanders. Oh, I didn't know that. It's a constant surprise, but we have to be engaged. We have to make connection in order for that to happen. So Sarah changed her mind about Christians when she started seeing and experiencing authentic, intellectual, caring Christians, she said, wow, they were open to and initiating substantive discussions. Who would have thought? They were winsome and confident. They were informed of their Christian beliefs and worldview, and they were able to ask good questions. She said one of the things that opened the door for me was a friend asked me, "Who is Jesus to you?" I had never thought of that question. I can't answer that. Maybe I should look into this. It's one of the largest questions there are in life. It also plants a seed. It's an invitation. My husband says, pray that they will ask questions, because if they ask questions, that's a door. And there really is a rational element to the gospel. Why didn't anybody just say that to me so that I could at least think it through? So we need to ask good questions. We need to make contact. But in looking at all of these stories, there was a common denominator. And that is that it oftentimes, although some were very intellectually driven and really wanted those answers up front, what opened the door was to see that there was a goodness to Christianity, that there was a normalcy, that we're not extreme or that we're not, the stereotype that they think that we are. For Sarah, she had a progress through her conversion where she started observing Christians' lives. And only then was she able to open herself to truth. She said sometimes resistance is caused by Christians because there is a sense in which someone has been wounded by the church, or a negative situation in which God becomes the enemy. If you don't have someone who can give you a larger picture, or who can say, it's a shame that you had that bad experience at church, but look at this as well. Don't let that be your only perception of Jesus. If you don't have someone who's in your family, or who is a friend who crosses your path as a teacher, or taken you to church service or whatever, what other cultural messages are there about faith? They are not plentiful. She said, one of my armors was intellectual strength, and I used to hammer all sorts of annoying questions. And the Christian she was speaking to did have a lot of basic answers that were helpful, but beyond that, I saw how he and other Christians acted and treated people. In many ways, they were living out the gospel, and I didn't know just what it was yet. And it wasn't like that they were cheesy people either, unbelievably good or whatever. They were funny and down to earth and made mistakes too, but I saw this difference. One thing that spoke to me was hospitality. Christians would have me over for dinner to their home and open their place for me to be restored. There was this gentleness and servitude and intuitiveness and many ways in which they engaged me. And certainly you can find yourself in that, and there's so many things we can do to change the negative stereotype to a positive, to something it's attractive, something is desirable, so that they would want to know whether or not it's true. The most prominent means of how and why people were brought to Christianity is one that they did end up looking at the evidence for truth. I will say that there came a place to where that they were willing to ask God to reveal themselves for many. A little over a third actually had what they called religious experience. And that, I think, was one of the most surprising things that I heard. I didn't expect it. Oftentimes you'll hear about religious experiences in the Muslim world and the unreached people groups and that sort of thing. Well, this is kind of an unreached people group that lives among us. And God breaks through. I had stories of dreams, of visions, of encounters, of amazing stories, not only dark spirituality, but also obviously encounters with Jesus Christ that were life transforming. Maybe at another time we can talk about that. But these conversions, it was a wholehearted kind of conversion. Sarah describes it as it was a combination of both head and heart. Yes, thinking Christians were able to answer my questions. They were respectful, they treated me with dignity, and they asked me questions. And intellectual questions, while really important in my particular walk, she said, were really great. But the Lord put people in my path who could answer some of my questions, but ultimately it was a combination of head and heart and all those things, but it was mainly grace. At first, grace seemed so appalling because I couldn't achieve it or do it or control it. And I began to realize I was in a lot of trouble. And grace spoke to something so unspeakably deep that I longed for and that I needed. There was actually tremendous freedom in that and a great relief that I didn't have to fix it or do it or be it all. So it's an amazing thing when God reaches down and transforms a heart. In terms of why they came to belief ultimately, it was not only that it was true, but also that it was good. They had to see that it was good, that it corresponded with their life, that it made sense socially and morally, emotionally, experientially, that it meets those deep longings, that it gives us human dignity, it gives us purpose and meaning, and it gives us rationality of thought, it gives us grounding for knowing good and evil, it gives us all of those things. They also had to know and be totally convinced that it was true. Atheists are pretty smart people, and they didn't want to believe just for a psychological crutch or those things in which they perceived those weak, needy things, but rather they can see how that works. All of those things, are the psychological and the social, are all good things, but it had to be grounded in the reality of a real God. And they found that real God, not only experientially, but rationally, intellectually, and spiritually, experientially. Powerful stories. That it all made sense. And I can tell you that these group of people are the most extraordinary, on fire believers for Christ I think I have ever met. That they take their light they have found and pull it back in the darkness because their lives have been totally transformed. As far as Sarah's concerned, she actually left a high-paying, prestigious job. She moved back to a different continent where her family was because they were all non-believers. She made that sacrifice because she had found something true, something good, something extraordinary. She wanted her family to know. She said, I come from a largely unbelieving world. I pray over that all the time. I've gone the gamut to everything from hitting people over the head with the gospel because I'm excited and you want somebody to know all that joy and life and peace, to not really sure what to do or say at all. That was one of the main reasons we moved home, to try and love on my family up close, to hopefully live the gospel and entice them to it in a way that just wasn't a phone call or an email. Really trying to live out being available. Jesus always made himself available, always present and available. And I pray that the Lord gives me the discernment to be present and available because there are opportunities. So ask yourself, how am I living in order to show and tell others about God? And because of time, we will kind of wrap it up there. She has amazing stories of loving others to the kingdom, and even the resistant who show signs of movement that were so encouraging. And I will say that one more thing in that not only are we living and learning and living and listening and loving, we just need to make ourselves available. God does not begin by asking us about our ability, but only about our availability. She says, and I'll wrap up with this. She said, So it's been those kinds of things, all of these things she's talking about with our own hearts and just being more discerning and listening to the Lord in terms of our opportunities and prayer and not putting so much pressure on ourselves to be everything, asking to be an instrument, but in it recognizing and allowing God to be in control because He is. And that takes tremendous pressure off of us and allows us to be active. Because I'm always messing it up, she says. I am always messing it up. But to be really loving, present, and available, because that's what spoke to me. And that is what spoke to me about people. I hope you've been encouraged by this, and it gives you something to think about in terms of reaching out and being available to others. So I don't know if we have time for Q&A, maybe just a few minutes. Thank you.